Right. They said.
Well, welcome back to Actionable Intelligence. I'm Eric Greitens. This is the show that respects your intelligence. We honor you as a citizen, and we bring you the perspectives and the voices that the mainstream media so often censor. Well, the battle over the election continues in the courts, and there's no one better to break it all down than friends of the show, Victoria Toensing and Joseph DiGenova. Victoria is a former Deputy Assistant U.S. Attorney General, and Joe is a former United States Attorney. Victoria and Joe, as you and I have talked about before, we've got a really sharp group of well-informed viewers. They appreciate the depth of analysis that we bring them. So I'd like to ask you specifically about the court cases in Pennsylvania to begin with. We have issues both with the state constitution in Pennsylvania and also the federal constitution. Could we start with the state constitution? Could you break down the issue for our viewers, please?
Sure, Eric. The Pennsylvania state constitution is very restrictive as to who can cast absentee ballots. It's like if you're really, really sick, if you're in the military, if you're working on election day. And for some reason, the Pennsylvania legislature, or Republican legislature, decided before COVID in December of 2019 to allow people to cast mail-in ballots for any reason whatsoever. I think there was a lot of pressure of the liberals, the Democrats going around the country and pushing people to do this. And for some reason, the Republican legislature caved. So the Republican legislature said you can have an absentee ballot for any reason whatsoever, which violates the state constitution. And that is the case that Congressman Mike Kelly is taking before the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and we'll just say
unconstitutional.
It's unconstitutional. And just like in the Congress cannot pass a law that violates the U.S. Constitution, a state legislature can't pass a law that violates the state constitution. And that's essentially that issue. But there's also an issue regarding the U.S. Constitution and the election in Pennsylvania. Could you also break that one down for us as well?
Sure. Here's what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court did. They got one look at that statute in a suit that was filed and said, well, it didn't go far enough. And so not only did they overrule the statute and expand it, but they overruled and violated the Pennsylvania state constitution by saying you could file absentee ballots 3 days later than the statute.
Count them.
You could count the ballots. Yeah, sorry. You could count the ballots 3 days later than was required by the statute. In addition, they said it didn't matter if it wasn't postmarked properly, and you didn't have to worry about the signatures. So that's what's on appeal, and that's claiming to be a violation of equal protection and due process of the United States Constitution.
And there's another issue, Eric, in Pennsylvania, and but these are such clear constitutional issues. I think those are the ones that are going to make it to the Supreme Court. But in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, over 680,000 ballots were counted without one Republican being able to view the process. Not a one. They were locked out, or they were kept behind barriers. That's against state law. That's a violation of the requirement that every party political candidate gets to have an observer of the process. And we were talking about the Alito case, where they said, okay, Sam Alito said any ballots received in those 3 days after the election day, you have to segregate them. Well, how do you know if they're segregated if there was no Republican there to see, if they weren't backdated?
Yeah, it's obvious. It's a major issue in Pennsylvania. I want to come back to that in a minute, but I want first to get your take on this mainstream media narrative that there's no evidence of election fraud. I'm not a lawyer, you guys are, but from my point of view, an affidavit, sworn affidavits, where you have people, in Michigan saying, under oath that they were ordered to backdate ballots. Hundreds of affidavits around the country from people who were swearing and testifying under oath that they saw or were ordered to participate in election fraud. To me, this is the very definition of evidence, but give me, from a legal perspective, is this evidence of election fraud?
The answer is yes, it is. But let's remember where we started. First of all, the mainstream media said there was no evidence. Then when all of these affidavits and testimonies occurred, they said, well, there may be some evidence, but it's not enough to overturn the election. In fact, it's enough to overturn the election. What is evidence? Evidence is testimony from a person. Evidence is affidavits sworn to by a person. Evidence is video of a ballot counting being done after hours illegally in violation of state law. A photograph is evidence. So anything that has testimony in it is evidence. And therefore, all the stuff that was presented at the state legislative hearings over the last week is evidence. That's testimony, sworn testimony from witnesses in addition to their affidavits. That's evidence.
And here, Eric, is what the mainstream media does with evidence. First, they say it's not there. Then when it appears, they say, oh, well, no, it's not there. We aren't going to report on it, like Hunter Biden's computer. There was never a Hunter Biden computer, was there? And just the clip from Atlanta, Georgia, where you see people counting the votes, that per se is illegal because under Georgia law also, Republicans are entitled to observe the counting process. So the guy who lied, the election official from Georgia who lied and said, oh, well, Republicans went home on their own. We have affidavits that specifically refute that. There's a clip from a local newscaster that said that everybody was asked to go home. And you know what? They just don't report it, except for the few outlets like you.
And let me ask you guys to put your hats on again as a former U.S. attorney, former deputy assistant U.S. attorney general. Our viewers, when they see what happened in Georgia and they're seeing this video with their own eyes, where it certainly appears that the press, that the election observers were ordered to leave and then election counting continued, they ask themselves, like, where is the investigation? From your perspective, is this being investigated? Why isn't it being investigated? Shouldn't the FBI and other law enforcement agencies be really digging into what appears to be a very clear violation of the law?
Well, Eric, it's a very good question from the listeners. The answer is it should be being investigated. That video alone from Fulton County of the counting going on illegally when there were no observers present is in fact a basis for a criminal investigation. That's a violation of federal law and also state law. Now, why isn't that happening? It appears that federal law enforcement is waiting not for a smoking gun, but for a smoking cannon of some kind. I happen to think that video is that cannon. Yeah. But I also think that if Sam Alito, over the next 24 hours, refuses to allow Pennsylvania to certify its election until he gets more information, I think that may be the event that triggers a federal investigation.
And here's why all that is important, Eric. It's because it's the state legislatures who determine who the electors are. And usually they give it to the popular vote. But when it has so many flaws and illegalities as the votes in Georgia and Pennsylvania and Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, then these state legislatures should get some cojones and say, we're not going to certify the electors. They don't have to say they're going to give them to Trump. They just say, we're not going to certify them. There's too many problems with the count. Why should Joe Biden people be rewarded for keeping hundreds of thousands of votes being observed by Republicans?
And I want to come in a moment to Justice Alito and his actions. But if you could please, for our viewers, break down a little bit about what would happen in a contingent election. Because a lot of people, when they hear, well, it's going to go to the House, they think, well, there are more Democratic representatives than Republican. But in fact, in a contingent election in the House, each state actually gets one vote. Could you just break down for our viewers exactly what happens in a contingent election?
Sure. What happens is when there are not enough electoral votes for either candidate, say they're each at 269, which would happen if, say, several of the state legislatures refused to certify any electors and send it to the House of Representatives, what would happen is, in the House of Representatives, each delegation for each state gets one vote. So since the Republicans have more state delegations than the Democrats, they would have enough votes to elect Donald Trump as president of the United States. This has happened before in the 19th century. And the Supreme Court in Bush versus Gore ruled that that process is recognized in the Constitution, that it must be followed. And they recognized the contingent election as actually being possible in Bush v. Gore, because in that situation, the Florida legislature had drafted joint resolutions saying that they were going to name the electors and not according to the popular vote.
And Victoria and Joe, just in the next 24 to 48 hours, give our viewers, if you could, a sense for what's likely to happen, the case before Justice Alito, and what might be happening here in the next 24 to 48 hours.
Well, a lot hinges on what Justice Alito is going to do in Pennsylvania, and that's what we are awaiting. And I think if he then says that there were so many problems in Pennsylvania that these electors should not be certified, it may give these other state legislators, who seem to be a lot of chickens and cowards among them, but some who are really adamant, and so they're trying to work it out, to say we're not going to certify electors when there are so many votes that are at issue.
Excellent. And that could happen as soon as
tomorrow.
So as soon as tomorrow. And then this would then give other state legislatures the ability to then make their own decisions about whether or not they are going to certify electors, or...
No, they have the ability. They have the constitutional authority. They have to get the cojones. That's the problem.
They can do it now. It's just if Alito acts, it may give them the strength to do it.
Excellent. Well, as always, folks, that's Victoria Toensing, Joseph DiGenova. We very much appreciate your expert analysis of what is happening in the election and your willingness to break all of these issues down for our viewers. Coming up next, it's going to be Ralph Reed with the Faith and Freedom Coalition talking about what's happening in the Georgia Senate runoff. Stay right with us. We'll be back in just a minute. Guys, thank you again.